I was 67 years old when a stranger called and told me that my entire life had been built on a lie. At first, I almost hung up. The voice on the other end sounded calm, steady, and far too familiar for someone I had never met. "Your parents weren't who you thought they were," the woman said. I stood frozen in my kitchen, one hand gripping the edge of the counter while the other held the phone. Outside my window, the maple tree in my backyard swayed gently in the Ohio breeze. The coffee maker hummed. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal. Yet those 8 words settled over me like a shadow I couldn't explain. "I think you have the wrong number," I replied. My voice sounded firmer than I felt. The woman was silent for a moment. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. She mentioned a silver music box. Not just any music box. The silver music box my father had given me on my 10th birthday. The one I kept locked away in a cedar chest upstairs. The one nobody outside my family should have known about. I felt my pulse quicken. "Who is this?" I asked. "My name is Helen Brooks," she said quietly, "and I've been trying to find you for over 20 years. I didn't know what to say. My parents had been gone for years. My father, George Hayes, passed away when he was 82. My mother, Linda Hayes, followed 3 years later. They had lived what most people would call respectable lives. They attended church every Sunday. They hosted neighborhood cookouts every summer. They raised me in a modest white house with a wraparound porch and a neatly trimmed lawn. They were not perfect, but they were my parents. Or at least that was what I had believed for 67 years. Helen asked if I could meet her. I almost said no. Every instinct told me to end the conversation and forget it ever happened. Yet something stopped me. Maybe it was the certainty in her voice. Maybe it was the way she knew about the music box. Or maybe it was because, deep down, a small part of me had always felt like something didn't quite fit. Tiny moments I had ignored for decades suddenly drifted back into my mind. Family stories that changed slightly every time they were told. Questions about my birth that never seemed to receive clear answers. Old photographs that felt incomplete somehow. I had dismissed all of it as meaningless. Families were complicated. Memories faded. People forgot details. That was what I had always told myself. Helen gave me the address of a small diner 30 miles away and asked me to meet her the following afternoon. Before ending the call, she said one final thing. "Bring an open mind, Margaret. What I have to tell you may change everything." The line went dead. I stood there staring at my phone long after the call ended. The coffee maker clicked off behind me. The house felt strangely quiet. I walked slowly to the dining room and sat at the table where I had celebrated birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, and countless ordinary evenings. Family photographs lined the nearby shelf. Smiling faces, familiar faces, faces I suddenly found myself studying in a completely different way. For the first time in my life, I wondered if I truly belonged inside those frames. And for the first time in 67 years, I allowed myself to consider a possibility that felt impossible. What if the story I had been told my entire life wasn't the truth at all? That night, I barely slept. I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of my house, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the occasional creak of old floorboards settling, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog somewhere down the street. Every sound felt sharper than usual. Every thought seemed louder. Around 3 in the morning, I finally gave up on sleep and walked downstairs. The moonlight spilled through the windows, casting pale shadows across the living room. I stood in front of the bookshelf where dozens of family photo albums had sat untouched for years. Without really knowing why, I pulled the oldest one from the shelf and carried it to the dining table. For the next several hours, I turned page after page. At first, I was simply looking. Then I was searching. Then I was questioning everything. There were photographs of my parents before they married. There were photographs from vacations, church picnics, anniversaries, and holidays. Yet something strange began to emerge. There was not a single photograph of my mother pregnant. Not one. I told myself that many women did not enjoy being photographed during pregnancy back in those days. That explanation sounded reasonable for about 30 seconds. Then another detail caught my attention. My baby photographs seemed to begin abruptly. There were no pictures from the hospital. No photographs of my mother holding a newborn. No proud father standing beside a hospital bed. The visual story simply started when I appeared to be several months old. I flipped through the album again. Then another one. Then another. The same pattern repeated itself. By sunrise, my dining table was covered with open albums. My coffee sat untouched beside me. The more I searched, the more uncomfortable I became. Around 7 o'clock, I went upstairs and opened the cedar chest where I kept old family documents. The silver music box Helen had mentioned rested exactly where it had been for decades. I ran my fingers across the tarnished lid before setting it aside. Beneath it were letters, report cards, greeting cards, and official records. Eventually, I found my birth certificate. I had seen it many times before, yet this time, I examined it carefully. Certain sections looked slightly different from the rest of the document. The ink varied in shade. A date appeared darker than the surrounding text. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was imagining things because of one strange phone call. But once doubt enters the mind, it rarely leaves quietly. Throughout the morning, memories surfaced that I had not thought about in years. I remembered asking my mother why there were no hospital pictures when I was a child. She had laughed and changed the subject. I remembered an elderly neighbor once telling me that I did not resemble either of my parents. My mother had become unusually irritated after that comment. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Children rarely question the stories they are given. By noon, I realized I had spent nearly 9 hours retracing pieces of my past. Instead of finding reassurance, I had uncovered questions. More questions than answers. When I finally glanced at the clock, I saw it was almost time to leave for the diner. I carefully returned the albums to their shelves. I placed the birth certificate inside my purse. Then I stood in front of the hallway mirror for a long moment. The woman staring back at me looked exactly as she had the day before. Yet something had already changed. The certainty I had carried my entire life was beginning to crack, and for the first time, I was on my way to meet someone who claimed to know why. The diner sat just off the highway, tucked between a gas station and a small antique store that looked as though it had been there forever. I arrived 15 minutes early, parked my sedan near the entrance, and sat inside for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. The afternoon sun reflected off the windshield. People came and went carrying coffee cups and takeout bags. Everything appeared ordinary, yet I felt as though I were about to step into a completely different life. When I finally walked inside, the smell of fresh coffee and baked pie filled the air. I scanned the room until I noticed an elderly woman seated alone in a corner booth. She looked up immediately. Somehow she recognized me before I said a word. Helen Brooks stood slowly and offered a gentle smile. She was in her early 70s, with silver hair pulled neatly back and kind eyes that seemed unusually tired. We shook hands. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Once we sat down, she studied my face carefully. It was not the curious glance of a stranger. It felt more like someone looking at a photograph they had not seen in many years. Finally, she reached into her purse and removed a large manila envelope. She placed it on the table between us. "I have waited a very long time for this conversation," she said quietly. My heart began to beat faster. "You told me on the phone that you knew something about my parents," I replied. Helen nodded. "I worked at St. Matthew Medical Center in Columbus during the late 1950s and early 1960s. I was a records assistant at the time." She paused before continuing. "That is where your story begins." I felt my throat tighten. Helen opened the envelope and carefully removed several photocopied documents. Some were old hospital forms. Others appeared to be registry records. The paper looked yellowed even in copy form. "Years ago, I came across irregularities in archived files," she explained. Most were simple clerical mistakes. Dates entered incorrectly, names misspelled, but one file was different. She slid a document across the table toward me. I looked down and immediately recognized a familiar date. My birth date. For a moment I could not breathe. There were records connected to an infant girl born that day, Helen continued. The information attached to those records changed more than once. I stared at the page. Certain sections had been crossed out and re-entered. Identification numbers did not match. Signatures appeared inconsistent. It was not proof of anything, but it was enough to unsettle me. "Are you saying I was adopted?" I asked. Helen shook her head. "I am saying I do not know exactly what happened. What I do know is that the official story does not fully match the surviving records." The waitress arrived with coffee, interrupting the conversation. Neither of us touched our cups after she left. Helen removed one final item from the envelope. It was a faded photograph. The image showed a young woman standing outside a hospital building. She looked nervous, almost frightened. Written on the back was a single sentence in blue ink. "Searching for my daughter." I looked up at Helen, confused. "Who is she?" Helen's expression grew solemn. "That," she said softly, "is the question that changed everything for me. And I believe it may change everything for you as well." The drive home felt longer than 30 miles. The photograph Helen had shown me sat on the passenger seat beside my purse, and every time I glanced at it, I felt the same uneasy pull. The young woman in the picture looked ordinary. She could have been anyone, yet the words written on the back refused to leave my mind. Searching for my daughter. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the afternoon sun had begun to sink lower in the sky. My house looked exactly as it always had. The flower beds needed watering. The mailbox leaned slightly to the left. Nothing had changed, yet I no longer trusted the certainty of familiar things. That evening, I carried several photo albums into the living room and spread them across the coffee table. I wanted to see my childhood through different eyes. For years, I had viewed those memories as proof of who I was. Now I wondered whether they might reveal something else entirely. I studied photograph after photograph. My father teaching me to ride a bicycle. My mother helping me decorate a Christmas tree. Family picnics. School plays. Birthday cakes. They looked like evidence of a happy childhood. And in many ways, they were. George and Linda Hayes had cared for me. They had provided a home, food, education, and stability. Yet as the hours passed, small details began to stand out. In nearly every photograph, my mother seemed slightly tense whenever someone mentioned my birth or early childhood. I remembered moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. Questions redirected. Stories interrupted. Subjects changed. Once, when I was 13, I had asked where I got my green eyes because neither of my parents had them. My mother laughed and said genetics were funny. My father quickly changed the conversation to baseball. At the time, I accepted the answer. Now the memory felt different. Around 9 o'clock, I went upstairs and opened a closet that had not been thoroughly cleaned in years. Boxes filled with old documents lined the back wall. I spent nearly 2 hours sorting through them. Most contained ordinary records, tax forms, insurance papers, utility bills. Then I found a folder labeled personal. The handwriting belonged to my father. Inside were letters, receipts, and legal documents dating back decades. Near the bottom of the folder, I discovered a hospital invoice from the same year I was born. My pulse quickened as I unfolded the paper. The hospital name matched the one Helen had mentioned. Yet something immediately struck me as odd. The invoice referenced administrative services and record processing fees, but there was no mention of maternity care or delivery expenses. I read the document 3 times. Perhaps there was an innocent explanation. Perhaps another invoice existed somewhere else. Still, it felt like another piece of a puzzle I had never known existed. As midnight approached, exhaustion settled over me. I placed everything back into the folder except the invoice and the photograph. Those remained on the kitchen table beside my birth certificate. 3 separate items. 3 separate questions. None of them proved anything. Yet together they formed a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Before going to bed, I looked once more at the young woman in the photograph. For the first time, I noticed a date stamped faintly along the edge of the image. It matched my birth year. Beneath it was a location. Not Columbus. Not anywhere near where I had always been told my story began. I stared at those words for a long moment. Then I reached for my notebook and wrote down the address. The next morning, I knew exactly where I was going. The address from the photograph led me to a small town nearly 2 hours from my home. I left shortly after sunrise with a thermos of coffee and a notebook resting on the passenger seat. The farther I drove, the more unfamiliar the landscape became. Cornfields stretched across the horizon. Old farmhouses appeared along narrow county roads. By late morning, I arrived at a quiet neighborhood that looked frozen in time. The address belonged to a modest brick building that now housed a local historical society. Decades earlier, according to a plaque near the entrance, it had served as a community health clinic. I sat in my car for several minutes before going inside. The building smelled faintly of paper and old wood. Shelves filled with archived records lined the walls. A volunteer greeted me warmly and asked if I needed assistance. I explained that I was researching family history and showed her the photograph. To my surprise, she immediately recognized the building in the background. "That was taken here," she said. "Probably sometime around 1959 or 1960. Hearing those words sent a chill through me. The woman helped me locate several archived directories and local newspaper records from that period. Hours passed as I carefully turned fragile pages. Most of what I found seemed unrelated. Birth announcements, church events, community fundraisers. Then, shortly before closing time, I discovered something that made me stop breathing for a moment. A newspaper article described a young woman named Eleanor Brooks who had spent months searching for information connected to a missing infant following administrative confusion involving medical records. The article was brief. It contained very few details. Yet one sentence caught my attention immediately. The search had begun during the same year I was born. I copied the article and read it 3 more times. Eleanor Brooks. The surname matched Helen's. My hands trembled slightly as I folded the photocopy and placed it inside my notebook. When I returned home that evening, I called Helen. She answered after the second ring. Before I could speak, she asked, "You found something, did you not?" I told her about the article. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Finally, Helen exhaled slowly. "Eleanor was my older sister," she said. I closed my eyes. Another piece clicked into place. "The woman in the photograph," I whispered. "Yes," Helen replied. Her voice sounded distant, as though she were looking back through many years. She spent most of her life searching for answers. She never stopped believing that something had happened to her child. My heart pounded. "Are you saying that child might have been me?" Helen did not answer immediately. "I am saying that the dates align, the records align, and some of the people involved are no longer here to explain what happened." After the call ended, I sat alone at my kitchen table long into the night. The newspaper article lay beside the photograph. Across from them sat my birth certificate and the hospital invoice. None of the documents provided certainty, yet together they formed a trail that seemed impossible to ignore. For 67 years, I had believed my story began with George and Linda Hayes. Now another possibility stood quietly at the edge of everything I thought I knew. Somewhere in the past, hidden beneath decades of silence, there appeared to be a woman who had spent years searching for a daughter she never found. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether she had been searching for me. For the next several days, I could think of little else. Every morning began with the same questions, and every night ended with the same uncertainty. I had gathered documents, photographs, and stories, yet none of them could answer the one thing I needed to know. Eventually, Helen suggested something neither of us had mentioned before: a DNA test. The moment she said it, I knew she was right. Facts could be debated. Memories could fade. Records could be altered. But biology told its own story. A week later, I sat at my kitchen table holding the testing kit in my hands. The process itself was simple. The emotional weight behind it was not. As I sealed the package and prepared it for mailing, I realized that I was sending away more than a sample. I was sending away 67 years of assumptions. Once the results came back, there would be no returning to the comfort of uncertainty. The following weeks felt endless. I tried to stay busy. I visited friends. I worked in my garden. I attended church on Sunday mornings. Yet every ordinary activity seemed to unfold beneath a cloud of anticipation. Several times I nearly convinced myself that everything would be explained by some harmless misunderstanding. Perhaps Helen had uncovered incomplete records. Perhaps Eleanor Brooks had been searching for a different child. Perhaps all of this was nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence. Those hopeful explanations lasted until the day the email arrived. I remember the exact moment. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Rain tapped softly against the windows while I sorted household bills at the dining room table. My computer alerted me to a new message. When I saw the sender's name, my stomach tightened immediately. The results were ready. For several minutes, I simply stared at the screen. Then I clicked the link. The report opened slowly. Numbers, percentages, and family matching information filled the page. At first, I struggled to understand what I was seeing. Then one sentence brought everything into focus. No genetic relationship detected with known members of the Hayes family line. I read it again, then again. The words did not change. My chest felt hollow. The room suddenly seemed very quiet. Outside, the rain continued falling. Inside, the life I thought I understood was slipping away one fact at a time. I sat there for nearly an hour, studying every page of the report. The evidence was overwhelming. George Hayes was not my biological father. Linda Hayes was not my biological mother. More surprising still, several close DNA matches appeared in the database. People I had never heard of. People connected to a family name that was entirely unfamiliar to me. Brooks. I immediately called Helen. She answered on the first ring. Before I could speak, she somehow knew. "The results came back," she said softly. I could barely find my voice. "They are not my parents." The words felt strange leaving my mouth. Helen remained silent for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried equal parts sadness and relief. "Then you finally have the truth," she said. I looked again at the growing list of DNA matches on my screen. Unknown cousins, unknown relatives, unknown branches of a family tree I had never seen before. For most of my life, I believed I had been searching for my place in the world. In that moment, I realized something very different. I had not been lost. I had been hidden. The days that followed felt unlike anything I had ever experienced. For the first time in my life, I was looking at evidence that connected me to people I had never met. The DNA report contained several close matches, but one stood out immediately. A man named Daniel Brooks shared enough genetic markers to suggest a very close biological relationship. According to the family tree information attached to his profile, he was 64 years old and lived less than 200 miles away. I stared at his name for nearly an hour before deciding what to do. My hands trembled as I typed a message. I introduced myself, explained that I had recently received unexpected DNA results, and asked if he would be willing to speak with me. Then I pressed send. I expected to wait days for a response. Instead, my phone rang the following morning. The voice on the other end sounded cautious but warm. "Margaret?" he asked. "This is Daniel Brooks." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence carried decades neither of us understood. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "I think I have been looking for you without knowing your name for most of my life." Those words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Over the next several hours, Daniel shared pieces of a story that felt almost impossible to believe. His mother was Eleanor Brooks. She had spent years searching for answers surrounding the disappearance of an infant daughter shortly after birth. Family members had always spoken about the loss in careful, incomplete sentences. Records never matched. Explanations changed over time. Yet Eleanor never abandoned hope. According to Daniel, she kept a box filled with documents, letters, and notes related to her search. Even after decades passed, she continued gathering information whenever a new lead appeared. Hearing this left me speechless. The photograph Helen had shown me suddenly carried far greater weight. It was no longer simply an image. It was evidence of a woman who refused to forget. Several days later, Daniel invited me to visit. The drive felt strangely familiar, despite leading somewhere I had never been. His home sat on a quiet road surrounded by mature oak trees. When he opened the front door, I froze. For the first time in my life, I saw a face that resembled my own. The shape of his eyes, the curve of his smile, even the way he tilted his head while listening. Details I had never shared with George or Linda suddenly appeared in another person standing directly in front of me. We spent hours talking around his dining room table. Family photographs covered the surface by evening. One by one, relatives entered the conversation. Aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents. Names I had never heard before somehow felt familiar. Then Daniel brought out a worn cardboard box. Inside were decades of notes collected by Eleanor. Newspaper clippings, letters, hospital inquiries, handwritten timelines. At the bottom rested a small notebook. The final pages contained an entry written only months before her death. As Daniel carefully handed it to me, I felt my heart racing. The handwriting was neat but slightly unsteady. The final sentence stretched across the page in fading blue ink. It read, "I do not know where she is, but I believe she is alive." I sat there staring at those words for a very long time. Eleanor never found the daughter she searched for. Yet somehow, after more than 6 decades, her search had finally reached its destination. After leaving Daniel's house, I carried the notebook with me everywhere. I read Eleanor's final words so many times that I eventually memorized them. Yet one question continued to haunt me. If George and Linda Hayes were not my biological parents, how had I become their daughter? The answer had to exist somewhere. Over the following weeks, Daniel and I worked together to piece together the missing years. We compared records, dates, letters, and family documents. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. It was not a dramatic conspiracy. It was something far more human and, in many ways, far more painful. Through archived legal records and correspondence preserved by both families, we learned that George and Linda had spent years trying unsuccessfully to have children. Friends and relatives had known how deeply they wanted a family. Around the same period, Eleanor had been searching desperately for answers after losing contact with her infant daughter following a series of administrative errors connected to medical and record-keeping systems that existed at the time. The more documents we uncovered, the more obvious it became that critical mistakes had been made and then quietly buried beneath layers of confusion, assumptions, and incomplete records. What shocked me most was not the possibility of an original error. What shocked me was what happened afterward. Several letters suggested that questions had been raised years later. Certain officials appeared aware that information did not fully align. Yet nobody seemed willing to reopen old files. Nobody wanted to challenge decisions that had already become permanent. Lives moved forward. Families adapted. Time passed. The truth became increasingly difficult to uncover. One afternoon, Daniel showed me a collection of correspondence that had belonged to Eleanor. Among them was a response from an attorney written decades earlier. The letter expressed sympathy, but explained that proving anything after so many years would be extraordinarily difficult. Reading those words made my chest ache. Eleanor had not given up because she lacked determination. She had been fighting a system that no longer wanted to revisit the past. As I continued reviewing old documents from my parents' estate, I discovered something that changed my perspective yet again. Hidden among insurance papers and financial records was a letter written by my father, but never mailed. It had no recipient listed. The paper was yellow with age. The handwriting was unmistakably his. In the letter, George described living with a secret he could never discuss openly. He wrote about fear, uncertainty, and the burden of carrying unanswered questions. He never clearly stated what the secret was, but several passages felt impossible to ignore. For the first time, I considered a possibility I had resisted throughout my investigation. Perhaps George and Linda had not known the full truth either. Perhaps they had accepted a story presented to them decades earlier and spent the rest of their lives trying to protect a family they genuinely loved. That realization complicated everything. Anger became harder to hold. Certainty became harder to find. By then, one fact remained undeniable. Eleanor had spent her life searching. George and Linda had spent theirs raising me. Both realities could exist at the same time. Both carried their own kind of heartbreak. And as I sat alone one evening surrounded by documents from two different families, I finally understood that uncovering the truth was not about choosing one life over another. It was about understanding how both had become part of mine. The months that followed brought something I had not expected. Not certainty, not closure, something quieter. Understanding. Daniel and I continued speaking regularly. Through him, I met cousins, nieces, nephews, and relatives whose names had been completely unknown to me only a short time earlier. Every conversation filled in another small piece of a history that should have belonged to me from the beginning. They showed me photographs of Eleanor at different stages of her life. In one picture, she stood beside a lake, smiling into the sunlight. In another, she held a birthday cake while surrounded by family members. I studied those photographs carefully, searching for traces of myself. Sometimes I found them in the shape of a smile or the expression in someone's eyes. Other times I found them in stories. Daniel told me Eleanor loved gardening, handwritten letters, and old mystery novels. I laughed when I heard that. So did I. The similarities felt small, yet they carried enormous meaning. One afternoon, Daniel invited me to visit Eleanor's gravesite. We drove together beneath clear blue skies and arrived at a quiet cemetery surrounded by maple trees. I stood before the simple stone marker for a long time. There were many things I wished I could have said, many questions I wished I could have asked. Yet standing there, I realized something important. She had spent her life searching because she never stopped loving the daughter she lost. Somehow that knowledge reached across 67 years and settled gently into my heart. Before leaving, I placed a small bouquet of white flowers beside the stone. It felt like the beginning of a conversation that had arrived too late, but still mattered. As the seasons changed, I also found myself thinking differently about George and Linda. For a long time, I had viewed every discovery through the lens of betrayal. Yet the more I examined the evidence, the more complicated the story became. They had raised me. They had attended my graduations, celebrated my achievements, comforted me during difficult years, and remained present throughout my life. Whatever secrets existed in the past, love had existed too. Eventually, I returned to the cemetery where they were buried. It was the first time I had visited since learning the truth. I stood quietly between their graves as the wind moved through the grass around me. I expected anger. Instead, I felt gratitude mixed with sadness. The truth had changed many things, but it could not erase an entire lifetime of memories. On my way home that day, I made one final decision. I would not spend the rest of my life choosing between two families. I belonged to both stories. I updated my personal records to acknowledge my biological roots, while keeping the Hayes name that had been part of my identity for decades. Some people might not understand that choice. To me, it felt right. The truth had not erased who I was. It had simply expanded the story. Today, when I look back on everything that happened, I no longer see a life defined by missing answers. I see a journey that led me to people who never stopped searching and to a deeper understanding of the people who raised me. The questions that once kept me awake at night no longer carry the same weight. In their place is something far more valuable: peace. For 67 years, others helped shape the story of my life. The chapters that remain belong entirely to me.